Hello and welcome back to the course on Goethe's novels. Last week we were looking at what I referred to as the politics of nature in Werther, and this week I want to expand on that idea a little bit more, but I want to take it specifically to where the novel turns political in a more explicit sense, and I want to talk about the politics of class in the novel, because we're not going to understand what Goethe was confronting and what he's trying to come to terms with if we don't talk a little bit about the class dimension of the novel. What Goethe is addressing here is the formation of a polity, the formation of a political community, a community with voice, with some kind of link to government, and also with links to the impulses that can be identified as what is best in humans. So we've got the same problem of human nature and the expression of human nature that we were talking about last week, but this week we're going to look at the explicitly political and the class dimension of the expression of human nature. Now, Goethe has little to say about government as such. At this stage in his life, he's not really that interested in the inner workings of government. In fact, he considers the day-to-day life of a lawyer in the making rather dreary. But later he's going to get much more interested in government when he becomes embroiled in the various different state activities which he will later assume in Weimar. So right now, it's not really government as such he's talking about, but he is very interested in how to think polity in relationship to the social classes. Now, there are three classes that are identified in Werther. The first is the so-called simple people. In the English translation, it reads the poor people, poor in the sense of poverty. The German says die geringen Leute, which I would translate as the people of lesser standing. So that's the first class, the ordinary people, the simple people, the people of lesser standing. And then we have the nobility, who is introduced in the figure of Count C, a rather interesting figure, and one who will continue to be intriguing for Goethe. This is the figure of the enlightened member of the nobility, who has the mental capacity to see that the bounds of the classes are somewhat of a charade, but still not quite able to see that it is an effective and well-policed charade, as we're going to find out later on in the novel. And in between these two classes we have Werther's voice, which is the normalized voice in the novel, until it stops being normalized, or until its normalization leads to catastrophe. And Werther's voice reveals itself as in the middle classes. And he thinks for a while that he's also a classless person. But he is going to discover very soon that this is not the case. In fact, there are interesting indications as soon as he's talking about the simple people and as soon as he's talking about the nobility that class is real. So when Werther starts first associating with the peasants and the villagers, he's very conscious of the divide in class that keeps the people of rank coldly aloof from the common people, and he tries hard to bridge that gap. I know very well that we are not all equal, nor can we be, he says, but I'm convinced that he who avoids the ordinary people in order to keep his respect is to be condemned. And when it comes to his relationship to the nobility, his take on class is really quite opportunistic. He says, I know perfectly well how inevitable class distinctions are. Indeed, I myself derive advantages from them. But I would not have these institutions prove a barrier to the small chance of happiness which I may enjoy on this earth. There are a number of parallel occurrences in the novel that carry the political message. One of them is what happens to nature between Homer and Ossian. What happens to the simplicity of Homer's nature, Schiller would later call it naive, and what happens to the wild, passionate, violent nature embodied in Ossian. And then there's also the story of the debacle at the court of Count C. But alongside this, there is also the development of insight into the lives of the so-called simple people or the ordinary people. And I'd like to just talk about that for a moment. There are three stories of transformation at work here. The one concerns the schoolmaster's daughter, and then there is the peasant lad, and there is the story of the nut trees. In book one of the novel, every time Werther relates an anecdote from the life of the simple people, he draws moral consequences, and every single time he is wrong. When it comes to the schoolmaster's daughter, he speaks of a tranquil existence, the confined circle of their lives, and no other thought. And when he reevaluates this in book 2, he discovers that all hopes have been disappointed. And the story of the peasant lad begins as a story of purity, intense desire, ardent affection, innocence, truth, fidelity, and tenderness, all of these wonderful attributes of true love. But where it goes in book 2 is melancholy, faults, defects, passion, a haunted love, and violence. And the story of the nut trees begins as a story of sheltering nature, delightful cool branches, and a story of intimate history marked by the growth of the nut trees, and soulful pleasure and real value. But in book 2, it ends as a story of violence against nature, alienation from nature, alienation based on superficial learning and religion. Enlightenment at its very worst, you could say, what Goethe later on will criticize as a utilitarian approach to nature. If the leaves are in the way, cut down the tree. And all of this culminates in the story about the madman who has fallen in love with Lotte. And here Werther makes the extremely important observation that happiness is only possible before the arrival of reason or after the demise of reason. And this is going to be a central concern when it comes to adopting the politics of enlightenment. How do you align happiness with reason? So just as in book 1, it looks like human nature in its simplicity and in its alignment with nature at large, it looks as though this contains the key to human happiness. It also looks like it contains the key to transcending the class barriers. But in book 2, where we discover an inner essence of nature which is disappointed hope and violence and alienation in humans, then what remains is that the superficial rules that structure society, they will work against equity. Then what remains is a completely different politics of nature. A politics of nature where nature's inherent violence has to be suppressed by the rules of society. And this is where we're going to find a confirmation of the class structure of society in the novel. So Werther discovers that the politics of nature is also a politics of class society. Nature, it seems, is a place of simplicity and benevolence, but it's also a place of decay and death. Human nature is a place of love and kindness, but it's also a place of disappointment and violence and alienation. And organized society attempts to keep this aspect of nature tame and complacent, to defuse its potential dangers. And to resist the rules of society is asking for trouble. Goethe will continue this investigation in his next novel, but before the first Wilhelm Meister novel is published, the French Revolution will occur, followed by the political terror of its aftermath. And it seems that the political prognosis of Werther was somehow prophetic, that this problem is going to be the major problem of Enlightenment politics. How views of nature lead to theories of society, and theories of how to create a just society and how to overcome the existing class structures of society. So that's all for today, and we will say goodbye to Werther temporarily. Next week we will begin with Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship, and we're going to be talking about the concept of Bildung. Apologies for the strange variations in lighting today, but I recorded the video at different times of the day. So I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.